Hey everyone, on today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast, I've got Paul Schnackenburg back on the show, and we're continuing our conversation about Microsoft security incidents. Now, it's not all bad this time. We actually have indications from Satya Nadella that security is becoming a primary focus for Microsoft, and we have a very lengthy blog post from Charlie Bell from Microsoft where he talks about how Microsoft is enhancing the Secure Future initiative. So Paul and I, we kind of dissect this blog post, that and lots more in today's episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Hey everyone, welcome back for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast, the podcast that brings you the knowledge and insights straight from the security lab here at Hornet Security. As always, I'm your host, Andy Serwich, and I've got a very familiar face. I've got Paul Schnackenburg on as my co-host today. How's it going, Paul?
I'm good, Andy. How are you?
Doing good. Hey, we've got more in the saga of Microsoft security to talk about today, right? I feel like that's all you and I have been talking about lately. And I mean, if you're a longtime listener of the show, you know Paul and I have been, it's been like a year we've been talking about this now, I feel like, Paul. We've been going for quite a while.
Close to it. It's a long saga. I got the sense that maybe this is the last one. Let's keep our fingers crossed. This is the last one in this long series. Let's hope so.
Hopefully. Well, to kind of catch people up, I mean, it's been a rough couple of years for Microsoft in the security arena, right? The two big ones that come to mind that we actually have podcast episodes on that I will put in the show notes in case you're interested is the Storm 0558 incident, as well as the attack and theft of Microsoft executive emails by the threat actor known as Midnight Blizzard, aka Nobelium, is another name that they're known by. And we have episodes on both of those. Now, that said, as a response to a lot of the security stuff that's been happening to Microsoft, and maybe I guess you could argue because of Microsoft in some cases, they released what's called the Secure Future Initiative. I think it was announced in November at Ignite, wasn't it, Paul?
Sounds about right.
And so Paul and I did a two-parter on that one where we dissected the Secure Future Initiative, what we thought of it, whether we think it's going to be a good thing or not. We felt like it was a little light, but we're going to get into that a little bit more in this episode. And one of the big things that we've said in that episode, and one of the other ones, I don't remember which one, is like, okay, where's Satya, right? Where's the CEO? We haven't heard anything from the CEO. And so before we dive into our main topic today, I want to at least acknowledge that there has been word from Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft now, and it's, I don't know, like two sentences that I have to share with you, but in an earnings call a few days prior to this recording, he was quoted as saying, and I quote, "Security underpins every layer of the tech stack, and it's our number one priority. We are doubling down on this very important work, putting security above all else before all other features and investments," which, thank God. I think that's what a lot of us wanted to hear, right? And I mean, I feel like they've had tunnel vision on the AI thing for a while now. And it's nice to see some acknowledgement from the CEO that, hey, security is becoming a focus now, as it should. Now, I know you and I were talking about this a little bit before the call, Paul, in before we hit record. And the question is, right, is it enough? And two sentences from the CEO on the multitude of security issues. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
I felt the same way. I would have thought it would be a much bigger focus, and I would have thought it would be a much bigger focus much earlier. I mean, I did make the prediction in an earlier podcast in the series that I think he'll be gone in 12 months from Microsoft if he doesn't appear to take this seriously.
I remember that. Bold prediction.
However, I suppose maybe we can give him a half a pass because it's an earnings call. So it's not exactly like, you want to spend half an earnings call talking about how you screwed up your own security. You know what I mean? Like maybe that's not the place for it. But I do think that if he doesn't show up on the stage at Build coming up later in May 2024, or Inspire in, I think it's June, in front of all the partners and say, look, this is what we're doing to deal with this problem. It is a serious problem and we are taking it seriously and we need to deal with it. If he doesn't put his words behind it, it's gonna look weird. Like, it's just, the boss is the boss, you know what I mean? It's just, he's the guy who lays down how it's all going to work. So I don't know. Yeah,
for sure.
Let's hope he does.
I really hope so. And I mean, I would make the argument that these security issues they've risen to such a degree that it's going to become a threat to Microsoft, to the business, right? I mean, the whole concept of the business model of, hey, let us be your cloud, let us do all of your computing stuff, right? That all sits on top of trust. And if there's no trust, well, I don't know if the business model works, right? But
yep.
Anyway.
I couldn't agree more. And as a Microsoft partner, it's a bit embarrassing. Now, fortunately, most of my clients are so small, they don't even realize, right? But if you're a bigger client, like if you're an enterprise client, you go, you know, what are you doing, Microsoft? The problem is, as we discussed before as well, it's not exactly like you have an easy alternative. It's not like you can just go, oh, well, we're just going to swap to something else tomorrow, right? That's not an option. Because when it comes to the collaboration platform, like, there isn't anything else. Yes, I know there's Google Workspace or whatever they call it this week, but it's not really a serious competitor to Microsoft 365. So yeah, it'll be interesting to see.
For sure.
Anyway, I mean, I suppose the interesting thing really is that we have a new blog post that came out on the 3rd of May, 2024, written by Charlie Bell, who is an executive vice president. I'm pretty sure he used to be the CISO, but he's not the CISO anymore, for Microsoft Security. And this is the blog post we're all waiting for. Because if this blog post had been out 3 or 4 months ago, you and I could have saved ourselves a lot of time recording podcasts and analyzing other information, because literally this is the one we were waiting for.
Right, exactly. And I think this blog post is, and it even mentions it a couple of times, this is like a direct response to the Cyber Safety Review Board's rather scathing reports regarding the Storm 0558 incident. And to paraphrase it, they said that attack should never have happened. It was preventable, right? Is kind of the short version of that. Again, another podcast episode that I will put in the show notes. I have, I forget, was that a two-parter, Paul? Or was that a one-parter?
Just a two-parter. That's another two-parter,
wasn't it? Where we picked apart the CSRB's findings of that particular incident. So again, very long saga. But this this blog post from Charlie Bell, I think it was woefully needed and highlights a number of key things that I think are very important. And I know we've got quite a few items highlighted here, but what do you think? We just start at the top and away we go?
Let's just work our way through it. I mean, I think the main thing for me is that the second paragraph mentioned the CSRB report straight up, right? Like we are responding to this report. We're not hiding from it and pretending it didn't happen or whatever. Right. Secondly, they link to it in the fourth paragraph, right? And before we even through the first bit, they say they're going to link the compensation for their senior leadership to the progress in meeting those security plans and milestones. So overall, obviously, we're going to link to this blog post in the show notes so that you can look through it with us. But this is the blog post that shows us they're taking this seriously. Compared to the SFI initially, right, which was very much a marketing salad, words that didn't really lay down what they're going to do. Here, they actually lay out exactly what they are planning to do. And I think if they actually do this, and they hold to it, and they stick to it long term, I think we might see some good outcomes. I think this is what's needed.
For sure. And I think as I was reading through this blog post, when I got to that point about compensation being tied, senior leadership compensation being tied to the security plans and milestones, that's the point where I was like, oh, this is happening. Like, this is going to be a thing, right? Because I mean,
Wow.
I, it higher likelihood of it being a thing, right? I mean, they could say that, sure. I,
Yeah, I
when
think my point is probably more along the line. I mean, I think it's good, and it's a great initiative, and I wish every enterprise on the planet did that, because that would be we'd be in a much better cybersecurity place. But I do think, like, a lot of these executives probably earn in tens of millions a year. And so if somebody
yes,
takes 1 million away from them because they didn't meet their KPIs, it's not exactly like they won't have money to buy coffee next week. You know what I mean?
uh,
I think that's the reality, unfortunately.
that's not
It's a
much
little
of.
bit different for us ordinary working grunts.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different. I guess it's not even really a problem for them, is it? Right? They just, oh, oh well.
I don't think so either.
Anyway, I think it's at least a. I think they mean well. Hopefully, right?
Yes. Yeah,
With
yeah.
that.
I think so. I think so. That's fair enough.
So, in terms of this blog post, I think really the core thing that it's communicating is that they're taking the SFI, which, like you said, was very much like marketing word salad, and they're expanding on it. So it feels like they're at least using it as a framework
Mhm.
for, you know, these new things that they're going to do as a response to the CSRB's report. And I think the first thing they say here, once we get down to the section talking about the expansion of the SFI, is secure by design, secure by default, secure operations, right?
Yep.
And when I look at those, I, those are all needed. And to me,
Yeah.
that kind of aligns with the messaging of what they said at the very beginning of the report and what Satya said in his earnings call statement. Security first, right? Is kind of what I
Yeah.
see here.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely. I think so. Two comments there: secure by default. Security protections are enabled and enforced by default, require no extra effort, and are not optional. I really, really like that as the
Same.
security defaults as they come out the gate with all the new features. That'll be good. I think the secure by design is another interesting one. I was listening to a really interesting webinar, I suppose you'd call it, with 4 of your MVP colleagues. I won't mention their names because I don't want to out them necessarily, but
Right.
one of them was a security MVP, and he was talking about how new features, new services used to come out in Azure or still comes out and in Microsoft 365, and how he sort of looked at it and said, well, you don't have enterprise logging, you don't have RBAC in place. How can this come out in this first version, right? And then he spoke to people inside of Microsoft and sort of had a bit of a light bulb working on a new service and a new feature. The way you're going to be judged is by numbers of users, right? And so initially what you want to do is you want to attract a lot of new users to your new feature, particularly if it's going to be an add-on license or something. Then when you have those numbers, you will be, promoted, you'll have more attention to you, you'll have more resources. And now you can go back in version 2 and 3 to really make it, having all those enterprise security features. And I
Right.
think that's the misalignment of incentives for the program managers, but that's what was happening, right? Because if your service that you come out with is really secure but has no users, that comes down for your review and everybody goes, well, nobody's using this thing, so that was a flop. Let's not use that one, right? So I think that's where that secure by design, if they really, really do it and really align those incentives for the program managers, I think that'd be good.
For sure. For sure. Because I mean, like, that security focus has to be there from the get go,
Mm.
even during the development phase. And I was recently doing some certification work, and one of the areas that I had to learn a little bit more about than I ever set out to was sec dev ops, right? Secure development. I'm not a coder. I'm not a developer by any stretch of the
Me neither.
imagination, nor do I play one on TV. But um, I one of the things I learned very quickly was like it is not hard to put glaring security holes in code. It is not difficult for that to happen. I mean, it's fairly easy to accidentally make code susceptible to things like race conditions and buffer overflows. And like that stuff happens way more frequently than I
Mm-hmm.
ever realized, right? So, I mean, that secure by design, I think it definitely, I'm glad that it's here and that they're starting from that point, right?
Yep.
So, as we kind of move down the blog post here, Charlie starts delving into a couple of different areas here. The first one that he really starts to expand on is protect identities and secrets, which arguably is probably one of the biggest areas of security is identity. And you know, you put a note in here that is kind of telling, right? Lots of 100% throughout this section, right? So, for example, just to quote a couple of the line items here, right? Strengthen identity standards and drive their adoption through use of standard SDKs across 100% of applications. And the
Mm-hmm.
next one, ensure 100% of user accounts are protected with securely managed phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. And
Yep.
100% is mentioned 4 or 5 times in this particular section. So,
Just in this one pillar, and there's
right,
six
this
pillars,
section.
right? So there's six pillars, and this is number one: protect identities and secrets. The other one that I think is really really interesting point on this one is ensure 100% of identity tokens are protected with stateful and durable validation. That, to me, if I read that correctly, is a direct response to the fact that the token that the bad guys got hold of in this attack had expired in whatever it was, 2018 or something,
Right.
but was still valid, right? And was also now used to issue new tokens, even though they weren't for that tenant, right? So I think that, and this is one of the, or a couple of the things that they talked about in the CSRB report. And because of that, I think that they're going to not only re-architect, as was stated at the last Ignite, a very interesting session by Alex Weinert, and rely in all the tokens or all the root keys are going to be stored in HSMs, globally distributed across all of Azure. But they are also going to tie them to validation so that you can always go and check where that key came from. And
Right.
that's much more powerful, and that's how AWS and Google do it. So I think that literally stops that whole thing that happened in this particular attack from ever happening again.
And that was the Storm 0558 attack that we're talking about, just
Yeah.
so folks are aware. That's the one where they, and I joked about this in last week's episode with our good friend Eric Siren. I, had to tell him about how we said they purloined a consumer signing key in that attack and did not procure it. Because again, for those folks that haven't watched previous episodes, procured implies they purchased it, which they
Yeah.
did not in that case. Anyway.
No, they
So
certainly didn't pay for it.
that's our running gag for this series, I suppose. But I think the other thing that I wanted to highlight here, and I mentioned it in one of the quotes I mentioned, was phishing resistant multi-factor authentication. One newish feature that I have seen this verbiage used a lot with is the new passkeys functionality in Entra. And
Yep.
Jan Bacher and I did an episode about passkeys. I'll link that in the show notes as well, too. I think I'm up to like the 7th podcast episode mentioned in this episode so far. But anyway, so I think to me, that reads like, hey, we're going to start using passkeys, right? Which
Oh, interesting. Yeah, that's
yeah.
interesting that you see it like that, actually. I'm not sure. I read that more like we're going to use Windows Hello for Business everywhere. And if we need even better than that, we're going to use FIDO2 keys.
Yeah, that could be it too.
Because yeah, we'll do a little side tour here. Passkeys are very convenient, and if they are device bound, they are as secure as a FIDO2 key or whatever,
Yep.
right? So if you have a device bound passkey for Entra ID on your smartphone, that's the equivalent of having, and I'm sure we're going to get emails now from some security experts, but it's basically equivalent to a FIDO2 key, right? Like you can't
Right.
take the key material off there. But remember, there are two flavors of passkeys. There is also syncable ones. So if you
Indeed.
talk to like a Google or an Outlook or an Apple account, and you have that synced to the cloud, that's very convenient because now you can use the passkey wherever, whatever device you happen to be on when you're trying to sign in. But if your account gets popped, you're in much bigger trouble, right?
Different story for sure.
So I
For
would
sure.
think that maybe they're talking there about device-bound passkeys as well, but I
Right.
don't think they're talking about consumer-grade syncable passkeys.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, when I think of passkeys, my brain instantly goes to device bound because that's
Mhm.
the benefit, the big benefit of passkeys, right? That and the fact that there's no secrets stored on the service end. But
Mhm.
that's a check out that episode with Jan Bacher and I. We delve into the whole thing, right?
Yeah,
So
that's a good
anyway,
one. That's a good one.
yep, for sure. So then Charlie moves on to a section about protecting tenants and isolating production systems. And there were some interesting points in this particular section when I read through it. And the first one that kind of, and you highlighted this in your document too, Paul, was maintain the security posture and commercial relationships of tenants by removing all unused, aged, or legacy systems. And when I read that, I'm just like, that's like security best practice, right? That's security
Mhm.
101. We don't leave stuff hanging around out there that's not being used. And something that I didn't catch until just before we hit record in one of your notes, there's something later on that kind of explains the difficulty here. It doesn't excuse it, but it kind of explains it. We'll get back to it, right? Um,
Okay.
and then he goes on to say the next point protect 100% of Microsoft acquired and employee created tenants, commerce accounts, and tenant resources to the security best practice baselines. Uh, so, you had a
Well,
note
I
here.
think I think this is the lesson from the Storm 0558 attack, right?
Yep.
You do need to treat all your dev and your test and your whatever other tenants. You need to treat them seriously, right? And I mean, we all do this. Like, this is not you and me being IT pros since forever. Like you set up a test thing, you don't care about backup, you don't care about security, and the password is password 123 because you don't want
Right.
to remember it, and it doesn't contain any sensitive data anyway. And then you install some little app that's connected to something else, and all of a sudden you just created a backdoor into something that shouldn't be
Right.
there, right? So, and then they do tie into that as well. Eliminate 100% of identity lateral movement pivots between tenants, environments, and clouds. So it
Now,
sort of feels to me like they had missed some in their guidance, in their governance here of their
right.
estate.
Now, to clarify, I think this is for the Midnight Blizzard attack, correct? Because that was the one
Yeah,
where,
yeah,
yep.
you're right.
So,
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
yeah, and because like that lateral movement, and they talk about that a little bit later as well, I think. But that lateral movement is ultimately what got them in that particular attack. I mean, that's a common tactic that threat actors use, right? Is like, okay, I'm in this tenant, but can I get somewhere more important, right?
Exactly.
So,
Well, thanks for keeping me straight with the different attacks here. They tend to blend up in my head, but you're
well,
right. We have one where they got into a separate tenant that was then connected with an OAuth app. We have a podcast episode on that, and then we have the Storm 0558 where they got key material to mint
right.
their own keys.
Well, it's no worries because it's like I was kind of verifying myself just because there's been so many and they're starting to intertwine a little bit, and
Yeah. Absolutely,
it's like
absolutely.
it's turning into a puzzle here, right? So anyway,
Yep.
so Then before we move on to the protect network section of the post, is there anything else you wanted to cover underneath protect tenants and isolate production systems, Paul?
No, I think so. I think that's fine. Protect networks is the next one to look at. Where I highlighted the microsegmentation, I think that's a huge thing. So I can remember at the last Ignite conference in Australia, I was giving a talk, and this is a good few years ago now, maybe 6 or 7 years ago. Virtual Machine Manager 16 maybe was coming out, and I was giving a presentation on that, and I was talking about microsegmentation for on-premises and how
Right.
how difficult that used to be, and it was now becoming a little bit easier with virtual networks in System Center Virtual Machine Manager. But of course, the cloud is the real key here, but it's still not easy. Right, like if you have a sizable Azure deployment or AWS or GCP, or whatever other cloud you have, but let's talk about Azure. Doing microsegmentation efficiently and easily is not easy. So it'll be interesting if Microsoft is going to come out with some more tools in this space, because I know there are some interesting third-party tools that do this. And for those of you who don't know, microsegmentation does exactly what it says on the tin. So if you pop a single web application, let's say it has some vulnerability in it and you manage to get into it, that doesn't get you anywhere else, because you can't go from that machine to the middleware machine or the backend database or the identity servers in whatever network this is in. That's all segmented off, so that you have sort of multiple honeycombs that you have to penetrate and find vulnerabilities in to go from one to the other. And that's much easier to do in the cloud, but it's still not easy.
Right. Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I was going to say, that functionality's been around for a while. So it's like, I would have assumed that some of that was happening already, but to your point, it's really difficult to do that. And more importantly, it's very difficult to do that at scale, let alone cloud scale, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean,
Yep.
So interesting. And then the last bullet point for that particular section: enable customers to easily secure their networks and network isolate resources in the cloud. Again, it comes back to segmentation, right?
Yeah. And if they can make it easy for us to do that, I think that's going to be a good win.
And I think that's the core thing, is making it easy, because traditionally it's not been easy to do. And I mean, there have been cases where I've architected something and I'm like, I sit down after it's all done, I'm like, this is the best design ever. Nothing ever is going to be wrong with this. And then I start looking at it and I start thinking like, a threat actor. Oh, okay, well, I could get in there and maybe over there, and there's so I mean, quickly it becomes, it's not easy. Bottom line.
Even better is you show it to somebody else, especially somebody who knows what they're doing, and they go, "Oh my God, you got holes here, there, and everywhere."
Exactly.
Number 4, protect engineering systems. Point number 1, build and maintain inventory for 100% of the software assets used to deploy and operate Microsoft products and services. My big comment on that one is, didn't they already have that one?
And see, Security 101 would say, you have a software and hardware inventory. This is what we have. So we know what we need to secure and maintain.
Yeah.
That seems like a big miss to me.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose, look, if you talked to Microsoft engineers 10 plus years ago, they literally weren't allowed to use open source libraries in their software products, right? Like they were tainting their software products if they did. And that's obviously changed a lot. So I suspect that some of what we're seeing here, and the last point is secure the software supply chain to protect Microsoft production environments. I suspect that they're facing the same problem as everybody else. When you're building all your software out of the Lego blocks of open source software, you bring with you the whatever vulnerabilities are in there, and that could be software vulnerabilities straight up, or it could also be, as we saw with the XZ thing over the last few weeks, it could be that supply gets subverted somehow, right, by something or other. So I don't know. They have
That
the same challenge as every other enterprise, I think, who's writing software.
that was a crazy, crazy situation with the XZ Utils package. Michael Posey and I talked about that a few episodes ago. Again, there's this episode number 8 that I'm mentioning for this show, but crazy where the threat actor had been assisting in maintaining the package for almost 2 years and
Mhm.
then eventually decided to put in this really tricky backdoor. That was a crazy one. The other one that comes to mind, kind of along the same lines, pulling in open source utilities, is the big curl vulnerability that came out. I want to say it was about 6 months ago now.
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
but curl is everywhere, and that
Mhm.
was a big deal when that one happened too. Not quite as bad as this really malicious, sneaky one with XZ utils, but you know the point stands. So,
Yeah, it does indeed. Number
um,
5, monitor and detect threats. Retain 100% of security logs for at least 2 years and make 6 months of appropriate logs available to customers. That's really reiterating the change they were dragged into kicking and screaming, whatever it was, 6-9 months ago, right? Where
right.
the 90 days of logging that they had for everybody just wasn't enough. Now they've given everybody 6 months, unless you pay for your E5 licensing, in which case you can have them for up to 10 years. It's interesting that they're keeping them for 2 years. I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's enough. Depends
I
on how
don't.
quickly you discover the breach.
I looked at that when I read through this, and I'm like, "There's no way. There's no way 2 years is enough." I mean, like, some incidents may take 2 years just to work through, right? I mean,
Yeah,
I,
yeah.
and then I have gripes about the 6 month logging. I've said it on this show before, and I'll say it again. Uh, I should have stickers made up. Logging should not be gated behind a paywall. I just
No, no, it
I
should
get
not.
I get it takes, you know, bandwidth, it takes storage to manage those logs and store them. I get that. I would rather see a subtle uptick in cost for the various services that would be impacted, and logging just comes packaged anyway, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
I think that would
I
be better myself.
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, this is obviously a challenge for every cloud provider. I mean, the cloud storage is cheap, but if you imagine that you have, I don't know, hundreds of thousands or millions of tenants, right, and all of them go from 3 month to 12 month worth of keeping of their logs, right, now you need 4 times the amount of storage.
Oh, for
I
sure.
don't really know what the answer is there, and I mean, realistically, you also, I suppose, if I'm thinking like Microsoft at this point, behind the scenes, like a small business with 5 users, they're probably never, ever, ever going to look at their logs, right? Like they
No,
might have an MSP that might go and look at the sign-in logs for Enter ID, maybe, but like
right.
most of them really are not going to go and look at those logs. And now all of a sudden you're buying, 10 million new hard drives just to store it all. You know what I mean? I can see the thinking there, but certainly for any kind of larger business, logging should just be built in. And
For sure.
a little personal gripe here: it should also be much easier to work with. Like there's
Right.
literally PhD level expertise to actually make sense of some of these logs, right? And if it's not something you do every day, oh, well, I know what Microsoft will say. We can sell you Security Copilot, and that will help you search through the logs, because doing it manually is a bit of a challenge.
And I mean,
Oh,
this comes back to the whole talking point around security as a profit center. And I know Microsoft's a business; they have a requirement to make money. I get that, right? Money makes the world go round. You got to pay the shareholders. I get it. That's capitalism, right? And I don't have a problem with that. But man, it's a tough pill to swallow when all these incidents are happening. You know what I mean?
yep, 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 yep,
And
yep,
I
absolutely.
agree. It's a tough thing. I don't know what the answer is, but that's the world we live in. So
Next point, 100% of security logs are accessible from a central data lake to enable efficient and effective security investigation and threat hunting. And when I read that, I was like, didn't you already have that? Like, isn't that the whole point?
I would have thought
Otherwise, I've got a
myself.
great product for you. It's called Microsoft Sentinel. I'll sell it to you. You can pay me. I'm a Microsoft partner. I'll sell it to you. It's a great solution for exactly that problem. So, I don't know.
Yeah,
So,
I guess I kind of in the back of my mind just assumed that was already happening, right? I mean, largest, one, you know, do they have the largest cloud market share? I would imagine if you combine 365 and Azure, they probably do have the largest cloud market share. But
by
that's an
by a
assumption.
long shot, I think. But whenever people
Yeah,
talk about public cloud, they always talk about IaaS and PaaS, and then it's AWS, Azure gaining on AWS, but still
right.
behind, and then GCP as a distant third. But yes, if you add Microsoft 365 to it, yeah, I don't think there's a question.
And so the reason I bring that up is like, I just kind of assumed as, arguably the largest cloud provider on the planet and being as big of a target as you are, you were already doing that. But
Mm-hmm.
nice to see that they're confirming that they will be doing that. So it works. The sixth section of the blog post, accelerate response and remediation. So again, now we're into the incident response portion of the equation here. The one big thing that we kind of highlighted here is that they're going to increase, and I'm quoting the article here, increase transparency of migrated cloud vulnerabilities through the adoption and release of Common Weakness Enumeration, CWE, TM. I had to throw the TM in there because it's actually in the document. And Common Platform Enumeration, CPE, TM. And really, this comes down to unified reporting, essentially. This is the way I look at both of these.
Yeah, I think so too. These are mitigated. You said migrated, but there is a mitigated cloud
Oh, right,
vulnerabilities. So I think this ties back to the thing you and I have talked a lot about, which is that we don't have visibility into vulnerabilities. We don't get cloud CVEs.
right.
However, I had never sort of dug into CWE and CPE, so I've done a little bit of looking, and I know you have too. And I don't know that they exactly tie in or make this that much better. Now, the Common Weakness Enumeration (CWE) is sponsored by the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and CISA, and it's operated by MITRE, right? So the MITRE attack framework, same people that do that,
Yep.
right? What they are talking about in CWE is like common vulnerabilities like buffer overflows or race conditions or hard-coded passwords or insecure random numbers. Those sorts of things are present, and you can find them in different scenarios. Like you could find it on a Linux server, you could find it on a Windows server, you could find it on an endpoint, an Android endpoint or whatever, or you could find
Right.
it in a cloud service. And the CPE is a naming standard for how to name different parts of a system.
Yep.
And it's part of how CVEs are identifying the product where the CVE is actually in. But I don't know whether this is actually saying that they are going to publish CVEs for vulnerabilities in their cloud environments.
Right.
Because nobody's doing that up until now. Like, that's not a thing that happens. So I don't know. Released high severity CVEs affecting the cloud, they say. I don't know. We'll see how that one
Time will
shakes out.
tell. And I guess the way I look at this, it's at least a start, right?
Yeah.
So, and if MITRE's involved, if it's got sponsorship from, the U.S. federal government, there's some people there that can help, push the ball down the court, right? Down the field, depending on the sport you're playing. But yeah, I think that's a good thing all in all.
Yep.
And
I agree.
then we're getting towards the the end of the really kind of actionable stuff. But there's one really interesting thing here, and like I said earlier, I kind of alluded to this fact that when I read it
Yep.
a second time, it really hit me. And and this is still under the accelerate response and remediation section here. Microsoft, Charlie, in this article goes on to say, while there is much more to do, we've made progress in executing against SFI priorities. For example, we've implemented automatic enforcement of multi-factor authentication by default across more than, and again, I'm quoting the article here, 1 million Microsoft Entra ID tenants within Microsoft. So listen to that one more time. 1 million Microsoft Entra ID tenants within Microsoft. And Paul, I asked you even just before we hit record, I'm like, did I read that correctly? Are they saying that Microsoft themselves has 1 million Entra ID tenants within their organization?
Yep.
And so,
well, they say including tenants for development, testing, demos, and production. But that is still an awful lot of tenants.
And so that ties back into our previous conversation where we're talking about the cross links between tenants, right? And how threat actors are able to, make lateral movement. And the question of like, okay, well, why aren't there red teams identifying these things? That's 1 million tenants. 1 million. 1 million. Like, I can't get over that.
I know. It's a lot.
Can you imagine sitting down in a boardroom with, a group of people and like, okay, team, we got to protect our 1 million tenants. And I'm just, okay, we'll get right on that, So it doesn't excuse it, but it at least kind of explains the difficulty behind it, right?
Yeah, same paragraph a little bit further down. They talk about having removed 730,000 apps across production and corporate tenants that were out of life cycle or not meeting current SFI standards. I think that is saying, hey, the midnight blizzard thing, we want to make sure that doesn't happen again. I think that's basically what that's saying is, we didn't govern this seriously. And again, it seems like an incredibly fertile ground for red teamers. And I don't know. It just seems like nobody did it, or external pen testers even. Like if I was hired to pen test Microsoft, that's where I would have looked. Well, prior to them doing this, I think it'll be a lot harder to do now.
A little more difficult for sure. And it brings up the whole conversation about, OAuth apps and the importance of securing them, right? I mean, you and I have had that conversation before, and there is podcast episode 9 that I'm putting in the show notes. So at least I think it's 9. I've kind of lost track, but that's what I'm going with. So, as we kind of wrap up Charlie's article here, I think it's the last paragraph, as we wrap up this episode, the last paragraph kind of summarizes exactly what their statements has been, right? And Charlie states here that, quote, culture can only be I butchered the quote. Let me try again. Quote, culture can only be reinforced through our daily behaviors. True.
Yeah.
And goes on to say, our promise is to continually improve and adapt to the evolving needs of cybersecurity. This is job number 1 for them, which is what they said at the beginning of this report and is echoed by Satya in that earnings call I mentioned earlier, which if they stick to all this is great. I think it's a good move for the industry, in my opinion.
Yeah, that is exactly what I feel like. This is the blog post that says, oh shit, we really screwed up and we are going to do better. And here is how the practical steps we're going to take. There's almost no marketing salad words in this.
No.
There's no legal weaseling in here that I can say, right? This is just straight up, okay, we screwed up. This is what we're going to do. We got three principles, 6 pillars. Under those 6 pillars, these are the steps we're going to take. And if they do all of that, and if they actually keep to that, we might see a stronger Microsoft on the security front.
Hopefully. And I mean, frankly, this is the blog post that I expected to see after the Storm 0558 fiasco. I thought for sure we would see something like this after that, but no, it was crickets. And then Midnight Blizzard happened, and then the CSRB's report came out, and then finally, I think it's kind of a big deal when the U.S. federal government is like, hey, you guys messed up, and it was preventable. I think that
Yep,
that kind of
yep, yep. That's right.
you
Right.
you start paying attention a little bit more, I guess, if the federal government's calling you out.
Yeah, that's absolutely it. Now, what we haven't really covered here, I just want to round off with this. There is a mapping document, a single page PDF that is linked from his blog post that maps up to. So the CSRB made 25 recommendations. Not all of those are for Microsoft specifically, some of them are for the government and CISA and other places. But basically, they are mapping up what the practical steps that they're going to do is how they map to those recommendations. Um, and yeah, but I think they've sort of covered all the recommendations that actually apply to them. So again, when you have the link to the blog post, you can read the mapping document. It's literally like a one
Yep.
page. It's not hard. So I think that's interesting that they're not just saying the CSRB made an interesting report. They're literally saying, well, these are the recommendations, and here's what we're going to do to map to those recommendations. I think that's the mature response.
For sure. For sure. Well, Paul, I appreciate you spending some time with us and sharing your knowledge and insights. Hopefully, this is the last time you and I have to talk about a Microsoft security incident for a while. So fingers crossed on that. It'd be nice
Fingers
to,
crossed. Fingers
right?
crossed,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Fingers crossed. Be nice to have you back on to, I don't know, talk about some 365 stuff like we used to, right?
Well, actually, we are going to talk about Windows Server 2025 security
We are.
improvements next time. So that's a good one, which has nothing to do with CSRB or Microsoft's
Yep.
failing. So
it'll be fun getting back into the nuts and bolts of stuff. So looking forward to that. But appreciate you spending some time with us today, Paul. And then
likewise,
those of you watching, yeah, definitely. Those of you watching, I hope you found some value in today's episode. Thanks for spending some time with us on your end as well. If you want to hit that like and subscribe button out on YouTube, if you're watching there, you'll be sure to, that'll allow you to get the notifications when we have a new episode live and all that. You can also find us on all the various podcasting platforms, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and all the other ones. It's late. It's going on 10:30 p.m. here in the U.S. I'm losing my ability to talk, but thank you for spending some time with us, folks. Really appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll catch you next week for another episode of the Security Swarm podcast. Stay safe out there. Catch you again later.